Vicar Van Baskerville knelt with his head on the guillotine block. He had given everything to the Baskerville family, his loyalty, his blood, his years, and this was his reward: false charges, an execution. As the blade hung above him, he made one silent vow: if fate ever handed him another life, he would never bow his head as their hound again. Then his eyes snapped open. The world hit him all at once: blinding light, deafening noise, and a body so small and heavy it felt like a prison. For a moment, he genuinely wondered if this was hell. Crying surrounded him from every direction, and the ceiling above him was completely unfamiliar. He was in a nursery. Rows of cradles stretched across the room, each one holding a wailing infant. Then the doors opened, and Hugo Le Baskerville walked in, the patriarch himself, moving between the cradles with cold, calculating eyes. He dismissed the crying children with contempt, calling them worthless without a second glance. But when he reached Vicar's cradle, he paused. This child was not crying. This child was silent, watching. Hugo ordered him moved to the Cradle of Swords immediately. Lying on his back, Vicar stared up at the man who had ordered his execution and felt nothing but pure, burning hatred. He already knew the truth. Hugo had planted those false accusations himself. And now, somehow, Vicar had been thrown back to the very beginning, reborn as the same bastard child, in the same brutal family, at the start of the same miserable life. He had clawed his way up from nothing, born illegitimate, raised without warmth, trained from childhood to serve as the family's weapon. An assassin, a spy, a conqueror. He had stayed loyal because he wanted recognition. He had sacrificed everything because he believed it would be enough. It was never enough. In the end, they executed him simply because he knew too much. But this time would be different. With a newborn body, he could do nothing yet. But being sent to the Cradle of Swords was not a punishment. It was an opportunity he had never received in his first life. Every child born into the Baskerville family faced one trial before anything else: the Cradle of Swords. They were thrown into a blade-lined maze and forced to crawl toward the Styx River, a legendary body of water with the power to harden a child's body into something close to iron. The river had limits, though. Only so many children could absorb its power, which meant the only way to claim it fully was to arrive first. And the only way to arrive first was to cut straight through the helix wall of blades rather than navigate around it. As Vicar crawled through the maze, blood seeping from countless cuts, he fell into the Styx River. The water poured into his wounds and seeped into his bones, and the pain was unlike anything he had words for. But he gripped the riverbed and refused to let go. The attendants outside were screaming for him to come out, terrified he would drown. Hugo watched with quiet amusement and asked his head butler, John Barrymore, how long the child had been submerged. 7 minutes, Barrymore replied. Hugo laughed and said the boy might actually die. The attendants begged him to intervene. Hugo simply called out for the child to surface. Vicar heard none of it, or rather, he heard all of it and ignored every word. He pressed himself deeper, absorbing as much as his small body could possibly hold, repeating a single command to himself over and over: endure, endure, endure. Eventually, water filled his mouth and he began to sink. Hugo reached down and pulled him out, smirking at the sheer greed of a newborn who had apparently tried to drink the river itself. Then he noticed something unexpected: the child already had teeth. He asked Barrymore for the boy's name, Vicar Van Baskerville. Hugo smiled and said a very greedy son had just been born. Half conscious in the patriarch's arms, Vicar was already thinking clearly enough to know that this was only the beginning. He would sharpen his fangs in secret for as long as it took, and one day, with his own 2 hands, he would tear this family apart from the inside. Vicar Van Baskerville grew up as the bastard son of Hugo Le Baskerville, one of the most powerful noblemen of his era. By the age of 8 in his first life, his intelligence was already obvious to everyone around him. Yet within the Baskerville family, being clever meant nothing without the right bloodline. He had no place at the main table. He was a tool, not an heir. As years passed, he had tried everything, countless disciplines, countless paths, before settling into the brutal craft of assassination, espionage, and conquest. By 20, he had already completed missions that would have broken most grown men. By 30, he had become a seasoned warrior, standing at the edge of the worst catastrophe humanity had ever faced: the opening of the gate to the demonic realm. The demon clans poured through like a flood, and Vicar threw himself into the carnage. For 5 years he fought, bled, and survived through an age of destruction that swallowed entire kingdoms whole. When humanity finally emerged victorious, the kingdom called him forward to receive his reward. What he received instead were lies, slander, a guillotine. Back in the nursery, Vickers sat up and took a slow breath. He had made it. 7 minutes in the Styx River, fully absorbed. He was starting this life with an advantage that his past self would never have imagined. Then the door opened. A maid entered, muttering quietly to herself about an order from Madame. Confused, it seemed, about why she had been asked to leave something on the young Master Vickers' bed. The maid set a box on his bed and left without looking back. He opened it. 2 bloody mambas writhed inside, hissing up at him with open mouths. Vickers stared at them with cold fury. Whoever Madame was, she had sent these creatures to kill him, and left enough venom in that box to wipe out every infant in the nursery. A clean message, a quiet elimination. He reached in with both hands and caught them. The next morning, the nursery staff arrived to find the child sleeping peacefully, with 2 dead vipers lying beside him. The nannies on duty that night were interrogated and executed. No one ever discovered the truth. Only Vicker knew, and Vicker said nothing, filing the memory away like a blade kept for later use. 8 years passed. At 8 years old, Vicker sat in class while his teacher walked through the ranks of swordsmanship. A practitioner who still could not channel mana into a blade was a beginner, nothing more. The next rank, sword expert, allowed a small amount of mana to enter the blade itself. Beyond that came sword graduator, where the blade radiated mana in a liquid aura visible to the eye. And at the very peak stood swordmaster, where the aura solidified completely and could be shaped freely at will. The class erupted in murmurs when the teacher confirmed that Patriarch Hugo himself had reached that level. Vicker was not listening. He was calculating. Specifically, he was working out exactly how many years it would take before he could kill Hugo. The teacher noticed his distraction, but chose to interpret it generously. After all, this was the child who had spent 7 minutes in the Styx River. The teacher was convinced Vicker was simply thinking ahead of the lesson, already planning his path to greatness. He was not entirely wrong. Class ended, and the moment it did, 3 boys moved to block Vicker's path. He recognized them the instant he saw their faces. In his previous life, these were the 3 who had stabbed him in the back while he was fleeing after the false accusations.
Now they stood before him, shoving his shoulders, mocking his van name, and bringing up the rumor about the Styx River and the 2 strangled vipers. Vicker looked at them and thought calmly that these 3 would become a serious problem in 10 years. It might be smarter to handle it now. One of them produced a knife. He taunted Vicker with the legend that a child who survived long enough in the Styx River would develop skin that no blade could cut through. His brothers agreed enthusiastically. One grabbed Vicker from behind and covered his mouth, then made a reckless promise. If Vicker could endure 3 minutes of this, he would eat his own hand. Vicker did not fight back. He let them play their game. 1 minute passed, 3 minutes, 10 minutes. The knife scraped against his skin and found nothing to cut. The triplets exchanged uneasy glances. The legend apparently was not a legend at all. Bored and unsettled, they began to release him. That was when the triplet holding him from behind felt something wet on his palm and looked down to find one of his fingers missing. Vicker turned around and spat it onto the floor. With a slow smile, he reminded the boy of the promise he had made. The other 2 triplets scrambled to de-escalate, suggesting they find a priest immediately. Vicker was not interested. He asked very quietly who had given them permission to put their hands on him. The triplet lunged with the knife. Vicker did not move. The blade hit his skin and stopped dead. Then Vicker took the boy's wrist and twisted, and the screaming began. In a low, even voice, Vicker reminded all 3 of them where they were. This was Baskerville. Age was not currency here. Strength was. Talent was. And he had both. He put the first triplet on the ground with a single punch. The second dove at him in rage and caught a kick to the face that sent him crashing down beside his brother. The third froze. The room went silent. 3 broken boys lay on the floor while Vicker stood over them, expression completely unreadable. He told them they would recover with treatment. He also told them none of them were leaving. They would stay and sit with what they had started. Then he picked up the knife from the floor and set it down in front of them. He said he would be generous. One of them could go free. They could decide among themselves which one deserved to walk out. He turned and left without another word, tossing over his shoulder that they should decide quickly. He was not waiting all day. At least one of them had to survive, right? Behind the closed door, the sound of struggling began almost immediately. Vicker walked away listening to it with quiet satisfaction. The Baskerville trident was already broken, brother against brother, fighting over a single knife on the floor. In the Patriarch's office, head butler John Barrymore arrived with unwelcome news. The Moore clan had begun occupying the ruby mines and was openly claiming them as their own territory. Hugo was unconcerned. He told John they would address it when the Moore clan came to them. Then John moved on to the interim results from the juvenile fortress. Master Vicker had placed first on the written examination. A practical exam was scheduled in 5 days. Then John hesitated. He reported that a significant altercation had broken out among the young masters. Hugo asked immediately how many had died. No casualties, John said, but Master Hibaro's teeth had been completely shattered. Master Middleborough's jaw was crushed. Master Lowborough's left index finger had been amputated. Physically, all three had recovered. Psychologically, John reported carefully, the damage appeared to run considerably deeper. Hugo stared. Those three were inseparable. They would never have turned on each other. John explained that friction with another young master had preceded the incident. An 8-year-old named Master Vicar, who had also scored highest on the written examination. Hugo summoned him. Vicar walked into the Patriarch's office wearing a small, composed smile. Hugo looked him over and commented that he had grown since their last encounter. He brought up the incident with the triplets, 3 senior students 1 year older, disabled by an 8-year-old. Vicar pointed out that all 3 had received prompt medical attention. Hugo clarified that he was not concerned about their bodies. He was concerned about what had been broken between them. He asked Vicar directly whether he believed he had done something wrong. Vicar asked what, exactly, he had done wrong. Hugo said he had torn 3 brothers apart. Vicar met his gaze with crimson eyes burning steady and calm, and replied that he had been the stronger one. If strength determined outcome, where was the wrong in that? Hugo told him that his brothers had forgiven him. Vicar went still. The word triggered a memory from before his regression. A young woman, the last surviving daughter of a family the Baskervilles had destroyed, standing before Hugo years later as a nun. She had forgiven him. Hugo had looked at her with something close to contempt and told her that forgiveness was simply the excuse of the weak, people who lacked the strength to take revenge and dressed their helplessness up as virtue. Vicar repeated those exact words back to him now. Hugo listened. His eyes lit with unmistakable approval. He turned to John Barrymore and told him to take Vicar to the food storage and let him take whatever he could carry. Vicar requested chocolate. As he left with the head butler, Hugo called after him, called him his son, and told him not to embarrass himself in the upcoming evaluation. Vicar kept walking. The warmth in his expression vanished the moment his back was turned. In the storage room, John began describing the chocolate, the finest quality, sourced by the Moore clan at considerable effort, a personal favorite of the Patriarch himself. Vicar cut him off mid-sentence. He said he did not want anything processed. John blinked. Vicar clarified, he wanted cacao beans, raw ones, with a strong aroma. The butler was bewildered but complied. A chef explained as the beans were brought in that these were bloody beans. 1 bean alone could yield 100 liters of chocolate, and the aroma was notoriously overwhelming. The chef watched Vicar bite into one raw and assumed, reasonably enough, that the boy simply had an unusual passion for chocolate. Vicar took the beans as they were and left. He had no interest in eating chocolate. He had a practical exam in 5 days, and he already knew exactly what these beans were going to do to a canine monster. What none of them knew was that something catastrophic was about to happen, something the Baskerville family had never faced before. The Baskerville family had earned its fearsome reputation the hard way. They were known across the land as the Berserker family, and with good reason. Training began the moment a child could walk. Endurance runs up steep mountain faces, strict rules about rest. And at bedtime, each child slept beside the rotting corpse of a monster, because the family believed fear was a weakness that had to be burned away before it could take root. These were not training methods, these were survival conditions. And they produced exactly what the family intended, children who were difficult to break. By 8 years old, the real test arrived. On the outskirts of Baskerville territory stood Laru at Lenoir Mountain, a place dense with monsters and sealed off from the general population. This was where the young hounds gathered for their evaluation. Shadow Dog Pavlo Van Baskerville stood before them and laid out the terms. Survive for 1 month. Hunt monsters. The scoring was simple. Surviving alone earned 10 points. Surviving without permanent injury earned 30. Defeating another contestant and surviving earned 50. Killing a monster and surviving earned 70. Accomplishing all of those conditions together earned 90 points. Stealing another contestant's badge added bonus points on top. Dying earned nothing. There were no 100-point results, a deliberate reminder of Hugo's own rule, that the moment a swordsman became arrogant was the moment they were already dead. Pavlo warned them to stay within the permitted zone. The restricted areas of Laru at Lenoir Mountain contained things that even the Guardian Knights avoided. Everything within the permitted boundary had already been subdued and catalogued. The Shadow Dogs would be watching from concealment throughout the entire examination. The young masters gathered. Some of them glanced at Vicar and started whispering about everything they had heard. The triplets stood nearby, visibly sweating. The bell rang. The field scattered in an instant. Vicar moved in the opposite direction from everyone else, heading straight toward restricted territory. The shadow dog assigned to follow him frowned and quickened his pace. This was the rumored prodigy? He was walking the wrong way. Vicar found a large tree near soft ground, decided it was suitable, and set up camp. The shadow dog watching him grew increasingly frustrated over the following days. While other contestants fought monsters and each other for points, Vicar dug holes, gathered equipment, practiced forms with a wooden stick, hunted small game for food, and slept peacefully under his tree. No aggression, no monster hunting, no apparent urgency whatsoever. Eventually the shadow dog gave up and went to find something more interesting to watch. The moment he was gone, Vicar broke into a wide grin for the first time since the exam had started. Camping outdoors genuinely reminded him of better years, quieter years. He tossed a handful of bloody beans into the fire, watched them catch, and exhaled. Good, the shadow dog was finally gone. All his preparations were finished. Time to hunt. A few days later, Vicar entered the restricted zone. He had been here before, long ago, in a different lifetime, scouting enemy terrain. He moved carefully, reading the ground. A burning smell reached him first, then scorched roots along the base of nearby trees. He followed the trail until he found it. Burning droppings, sulfur-soaked and still smoldering. Only one creature left waste like that. The hellhound stepped out of the shadows with fire spilling from its jaws, a B+ rated monster standing 3 meters tall, with sulfuric flames that erupted from both its mouth and its eyes. Volatile, unpredictable, lethal on contact. A single bite meant death, and anything it used as fuel burned completely to nothing. In his previous life, Vicar had barely survived an encounter with one of these at 18 years old. He was 8 now, and he had no intention of fighting it directly. But he remembered exactly how to handle it. As the hellhound lunged in a straight line, Vicar stepped aside. First weakness: hellhounds could only charge in straight lines and could not change direction mid-movement. He poured water across the ground ahead of it. Second weakness: canine monsters could not cross water. They would reroute rather than step through it, even a shallow puddle, and rerouting cost them time, and exposed a third weakness that all canine monsters shared. They ran with their mouths open. The hellhound came again, jaws wide. Vicar threw a bloody bean directly into its throat. The effect was immediate. The creature buckled, whimpering, and lost all coordination. Vicar had explained it simply enough to himself. Chocolate was toxic to canines, and a single bloody bean produced 100 liters of the substance inside a body that was not built to handle even a fraction of that. He drew his sword and drove it into the one gap in the hellhound's ribcage that left the kidney exposed. One clean strike. The monster dropped and did not get up. Energy poured into Vicar's body as he absorbed the kill, karma, the lifeblood of combat, and he felt his sword arm lighten noticeably. He was already approaching the level of strength he had held in his prime, and he had not even turned 9 yet. He found himself genuinely curious what expression would cross Hugo's face when an 8-year-old child walked back into the fortress carrying a B+ ranked monster. He raised his sword to take the head. Then the remaining hellhounds appeared. A group of them, drawn by the death of their companion, closed in from multiple angles. Vicar stayed calm. He still had plenty of bloody beans, and he knew every weakness these creatures had. He held the severed head up and taunted them, sword ready. Then he noticed one of them whimpering. That was wrong. Hellhounds did not show fear. They would keep attacking until they physically could not move. Not because they were loyal, but because retreating simply was not in their nature. Something had frightened them badly enough to override instinct entirely. Vicar turned around. 7 meters tall. 3 heads, eyes burning with intelligence older than the mountain itself. Cerberus, an A+ rated monster, the gatekeeper of the Path of the Dead. Its domain was the 7th ridge of Laru at Lenoir Mountain, nowhere near here. Vicar stared at it and noticed the arrows buried in its flanks, the wounds still weeping. Someone had engaged this creature and driven it out of its territory. Someone had been hunting it. An injured A-rank monster was still an A-rank monster. But injured was better than healthy, and Vicar had been hiding the full extent of his abilities this entire exam. His body was iron hard from the Styx River. His swordsmanship had been forged across 5 years of demon clan warfare that this version of himself had not yet lived through. He attacked. For a time it went well. He landed solid hit after solid hit, reading the creature's movements and exploiting the wounds already carved into it. He began to believe he could finish this. Then he lowered his guard for a fraction of a second. The first counterattack destroyed his sword. The second launched him through the air and drove him into a tree trunk with enough force to split the bark. He hit the ground with blood pouring from his mouth, arm screaming with pain, body completely broken. He lay still for several seconds. Then he opened his eyes, checked that his left arm was still attached. It was, barely, and accepted the reality of his situation with the practiced calm of someone who had been in far worse positions and survived all of them. He could not take another direct hit, that was simply a fact. He rolled clear as Cerberus charged again and ran. There was no shame in it. He had learned that lesson the hard way, in his first life. Ahead through the trees he spotted an iron fence, the boundary of the restricted area. He pushed himself harder. The fence blurred past him and he burst through it, heart hammering, and immediately began scanning the woods for the thing he had prepared before the exam ever began. He found it. He dove forward at full speed, clearing a hidden pit by inches. Cerberus thundered after him and went straight in, crashing down onto wooden spears arranged across the bottom. The creature thrashed and growled, foam building at its mouths. Vicar had spent his quiet days at camp coating every one of those spears with concentrated bloody bean essence, potent enough to stop a canine monster in its tracks. He grabbed a loose spear, stepped to the edge of the pit, and drove it into Cerberus's side. The beast did not fall. It climbed out and kept coming. Vicar watched it and counted each step. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Cerberus stopped mid-stride and collapsed at his feet. Vicar exhaled slowly. The rumors about the bloody mamba venom had been accurate. He had kept a supply of it since childhood, knowing the day would come when it proved essential. A single strike from a weapon coated in that venom, and the victim could not take more than 7 steps. The 3 heads went still. The energy surged into him. He stood over the fallen body of an A+ ranked monster and let himself feel, for just a moment, the particular satisfaction of having planned better than the monster he was fighting. Then the practical reality set in. He had absolutely no idea how he was going to explain transporting a 7-meter corpse back to the fortress. He thought through his options. Then something else occurred to him. Cerberus was a gatekeeper, which meant it had been guarding something. Vicar rubbed Cerberus's waist across his clothing, an effective deterrent against anything smaller that might track his scent, and followed the creature's trail back through the forest. Dry soil gave way to rotten leaves, then to damp roots, and finally to a dark opening in the earth that he recognized the moment he saw it. He had been here before, not in this life, in the next one. 10 years from now, in his first timeline, this dungeon would be discovered and picked completely clean. Right now it was untouched, sealed off by the creature he had just killed, pulsing with mana beneath the soil. He stepped inside. The darkness went deeper than he expected. Ruby deposits lined the walls, veins of it threading through the stone in directions that likely connected to Red All Mountain nearby. Then, far ahead, a faint glow. He followed it into a brightly lit chamber. At the center stood a massive ruby mounted on a stone pillar, radiating mana in slow, even pulses. It was beautiful. It was also clearly serving a purpose beyond decoration. Then he saw the skeleton. Deep stab wounds, long dried blood soaked into the stone beneath. Someone had died here, and not quickly. A folded letter lay beside the remains. He picked it up. The author introduced himself as Kane, adding that he did not wish to stain clean paper with his full name. The handwriting was unmistakably Baskerville. Vicar read on. Kane and his twin brother Abel had spent years chasing the legend of a stone chamber hidden within Baskerville territory, a place spoken of in whispers across generations. When they finally found it, the dungeon's final task trapped them inside for 3 years. They fought through everything it threw at them. They sacrificed more than either of them had expected to give. And when they reached the inner chamber, a riddle carved into the monument was all that stood between them and the treasure. When entering, it is 1. Once inside, it is 2. When leaving, it is 1. Kane wrote that after much deliberation, he and Abel had arrived at an interpretation. They were twins, 2 halves of one origin. To become one again, only one of them could leave with the prize. The logic seemed sound at the time. Kane had killed his brother. The treasure did not move. Nothing changed. One had become one, just as the riddle required, and still the chamber held its secret. Kane had eventually given up, carved out his warning for anyone who came after him, and apparently died before he could leave. The letter ended with a simple message. There is nothing in this place but mockery for humans. Do not enter. Vicar set the letter down and stared at the ruby. The riddle ran through his mind again. When entering, it is 1. Once inside, it is 2. When leaving, it is 1. Kane and Abel had made a mistake. They had approached the puzzle as a question about people, about individuals, about themselves. Vicar walked slowly toward the ruby, studying the architecture of the room, a dark passage leading into a brightly lit stone chamber. He stood in the doorway and looked down. One shadow. He stepped forward into the light, and the ruby's glow split the world beneath him into 2 distinct shapes. 2 shadows. He shattered the ruby. The light died. A single shadow stretched behind him. The chamber cracked open. The flash cleared. On a stone pedestal at the far end of the newly revealed room stood a sword unlike anything Vicar had ever seen outside of written history. Black, radiating an evil aura that pressed against the air like a physical force. An inscription was carved into the pedestal beneath it. Only those with Baskerville blood may take Beelzebub. Vicar stared at it. He knew that name. Every child in the Baskerville family knew that name, though most assumed it was nothing more than a legend used to make history sound more dramatic. Beelzebub, the gluttonous fly, one of the 7 calamities. A creature so devastating that the heads of all 7 great families had united to stop it in ancient times. The first Baskerville patriarch had faced it personally. The remnants of its power, it was said, had been sealed somewhere within Baskerville territory. The sword before him was the proof that none of it had been legend. He also remembered something else. This blade had been stolen by the demon clans during the war. The losses it had caused were catastrophic. Entire battalions, wiped out because the enemy had wielded something that should never have left Baskerville hands. He reached for the hilt. Energy flooded into his palm the instant he touched it. He tightened his grip and the sword disappeared. Not dropped, not destroyed, but absorbed directly into his hand as if it had always been part of him. When he extended his palm, it reappeared, fully formed, trailing a faint dark aura. He turned the blade over in the light of the now empty chamber and felt the weight of what he was holding. Born from the remains of a creature that had once threatened to end the continent, now fused to his hand. He smiled quietly to himself and wondered, for the first time with genuine optimism, exactly how strong he was going to become in this second life. He began making his way out of the dungeon, and then without warning his legs gave out. He hit his knees on the stone floor, dizzy and ravenous in a way that had nothing to do with how long he had last eaten. He looked down at his hand and heard something, not a voice exactly, but a presence, a demand, pressing from inside the blade fused to his palm. Beelzebub was hungry. And whatever Beelzebub felt, Vicar felt too. He followed the sword's pull through the forest, half running as it dragged his arm forward with single-minded purpose, until he reached the hellhound corpse he had left behind earlier. He extended his palm toward the body and watched the blade drink. The hunger faded as the blood was absorbed. Vicar stood over the drained corpse and studied the dried-out trees nearby, connecting dots. The barren soil, the dead undergrowth, the mountain nearby that looked like something had been feeding on it for years. He looked down at the sword with something approaching exasperation. Beelzebub finished its meal and made a sound that was entirely too satisfied for a weapon. With the sword full, Vicar took inventory of its abilities. The innate power was listed as Glutton of Flies, an ability that allowed Beelzebub to absorb the skills of anyone it cut, permanently stripping them of their techniques and adding those techniques to its own arsenal. The capacity was nearly limitless. Entire warriors had been rendered completely useless after a single encounter with this blade. The catch was that it could only hold 3 abilities at once. The first slot was already filled. Hemorrhage, acquired from the Hellhound. B+ rank. Any wound inflicted by the blade would bleed continuously, unable to stop. Vicar took the sword to Cerberus's body and watched it begin feeding. He had to physically tap the blade and tell it firmly to stop. If Cerberus was too badly consumed, explaining the body during the post-exam autopsy would become an uncomfortable problem. Beelzebub produced a sound very much like a child being denied dessert. All 3 slots were now filled. Burn injury from Cerberus, A+ rank. Any wound from the blade would cause ongoing thermal damage long after the initial strike, one of the most unbearable forms of suffering a human body could experience. Hemorrhage from the Hellhound, B+ rank. Continuous bleeding from any wound. And in the third slot, unexpectedly, high-speed regeneration, F rank, from a sewer rat. Vicar looked beneath Cerberus and found the flattened remains of a rat that had apparently been crushed when the monster fell. Beelzebub had eaten it without being asked. He stared at the F rank ability for a moment, then decided it was still useful and moved on. The body was prepared. The exam had a few days left. There was nothing left to do but wait. The young hounds returned from Laru at Lenoir Mountain and gathered for their evaluations. Rewards were handed out: shields, swords, and necklaces crafted from monster parts, each one matched to what its recipient had hunted. The atmosphere was competitive, celebratory. Most of the young masters were proud of what they had brought back. Then the examiners reached Vicar's submission. Hugo looked up from his desk at John Barrymore and said, slowly, that he needed to hear that again. John repeated it. Master Vicar Van Baskerville, 8 years old, had hunted and killed Cerberus, an A+ ranked monster, during the practical examination. The creature had crossed into the permitted zone from the restricted area, and Vicar had engaged it, killing it with a wooden spear coated in an unidentified poison. The details of the poison were not in the report. John had intended to ask Vicar directly, but the boy had returned to his dormitory citing exhaustion and had not been available for follow-up. Hugo leaned back and said, with what sounded almost like admiration, that the child was already sly. He understood instinctively that information was a resource just like any other, and a resource you gave away was a resource you no longer had. John ventured that he had not expected a child bearing the Van name to demonstrate this level of talent. Hugo replied without hesitation that he did not sort hounds by bloodline. He sorted them by talent and spite. Bastards could carry royal ability in their blood just as easily as anyone born to the main line. He told John he needed something to improve his mood. John offered to summon Vicar. Vicar stood before Patriarch Hugo with a composed expression and steady hands. Hugo asked him directly how an 8-year-old child had killed something that experienced guardian knights actively avoided engaging. Vicar explained, chocolate. specifically a wooden spear coated in the essence of bloody beans, lethal to canine monsters. He had requested the beans from the storage before the exam for exactly this purpose. Hugo's eyebrows rose as several things connected themselves simultaneously. He noted that this was why Vicar had asked for chocolate, a request that had seemed merely eccentric at the time. The head butler standing nearby found himself quietly stunned by how casually the two of them were speaking. Father and son, patriarch and bastard child, talking about poison and monster hunting like two veterans comparing field notes. Hugo pointed out that Vicar had not answered the head butler's questions when asked earlier. Vicar said simply that John Barrymore was not his master. Hugo asked who his master was. Vicar said that since he belonged to the clan, the master of the clan was his master. Hugo smirked. He congratulated Vicar on the hunt and announced the reward. The Cerberus corpse would belong to Vicar alone. And as the highest scorer in the examination, he was entitled to make one request of the patriarch, anything within reason. Vicar did not hesitate. He wanted access to the 10,000 epistle library. Hugo's expression shifted slightly. The 10,000 epistle library was one of the largest collections in the entire empire, housed deep within the Baskerville compound. Access was restricted to the patriarch, his second-in-command, and direct descendants. He pointed this out. Vicar said he would withdraw the request if it was not possible. He had already identified 2 alternate ways to get inside without permission. Hugo granted it, and then went further. He told Vicar to seek out the Baskerville 6th technique, held in the 6th restricted section of the library. Vicar kept his expression steady with some effort. An illegitimate child being given access to the 6th technique was simply not something that happened. Baskerville children with van names were barred from anything beyond the 4th. The rule existed precisely to ensure that the hounds the family raised could never develop enough mastery to threaten the family itself. Hugo was, knowingly or not, handing Vicar something he had no business holding. He thought about it carefully. The 6th technique was valuable, but it was not what he had come for. Hugo was currently at the 7th. Before the regression, he had mastered 9 fangs. Vicar's true goal was something far older, the original textbook of the first patriarch, the man who had personally defeated all 7 of the great calamities. That text was the foundation everything else was built on. Hugo had no idea what he was actually giving away. Vicar arrived at the 10,000 epistle library for the first time and looked around in quiet amazement. As he moved through the shelves, he read the titles to himself. Severing incisors, grinding molars, piercing canines, snaggletooth that embeds twice, wisdom teeth that lay down, and many more books on swordsmanship. These were the very teachings he had desperately wanted to study in his previous life, yet never had access to. But Vicar knew the truth of it well. No matter how much mana a legitimate Baskerville child possessed, they were forbidden from learning any swordsmanship beyond the 4th technique. The family had built that restriction deliberately, a safeguard, to ensure that the children raised as hounds would never turn their teeth toward their own master. Eventually, he reached a book bound in chains with a lock fastened at the center. He stood before it and wondered whether this was truly it, the book on the 6th technique. He still could hardly believe Hugo had offered him access to it. Before his regression, he would never have dared to dream of such a thing. As he undid the lock, he reminded himself that Hugo had almost certainly allowed it on the assumption that an 8-year-old child could not possibly memorize the entire contents in a single day. But Hugo did not know what Vicar knew. Long before his regression, he had studied the theory behind the 1st through 4th techniques until he was thoroughly sick of them, all in the hope of deducing the 5th on his own. Through that process, a realization had finally come to him. After drawing the 4th fang, he should have stopped the flow of mana. That, perhaps, was why the 5th fang had always been just out of reach. Baskerville swordsmanship carried a distinct trait: 1 fang for the 1st technique, 2 for the 2nd, and so on up the chain. And whenever the fangs were drawn, a red sword energy would appear along the blade. Yet even standing here with the 6th technique within his grasp, Vicar felt no particular excitement about it. He had not come to the 10,000 epistle library for the 6th technique. He had come for something far more valuable. Something hidden where no one else had thought to look. As Vicar walked away, the guards whispered among themselves, commenting that the section he was heading toward contained nothing but miscellaneous books. One of them suggested that if it were him, he would have stayed to study the swordsmanship text deeper within the library, wondering if Vicar simply didn't know their worth because of his age. Vicar overheard every word and allowed them to keep their assumptions. He knew that somewhere among those dusty, forgotten shelves lay a treasure no one else had recognized. Then his eyes landed on it, a worn, battered book titled A Lurking Ambush. He reached for it and held it carefully, noting the ripped pages and its thoroughly unremarkable appearance. But he knew its true worth better than anyone. He remembered a time before his regression, when he was affiliated with the Hound Squad. They had once discovered a single torn page bearing Baskerville's handwriting, and Hugo, obsessed with finding the book it belonged to, had scoured the entire library before locating it here. buried among the miscellaneous collection. That book contained the writings of the Baskerville ancestors, including the 10th technique, which Hugo had gone to war over, sending hounds to the 7 great families to retrieve the missing pages. Many died for those pages. And in the end, the only reward Hugo gave was 2 simple words: good job. Vickers' eyes narrowed with anger at the memory. He would not let that happen again. He read the book through the night, and by the time he closed it, darkness had given way to daylight. He marveled at how much he had absorbed and felt a quiet pride settle over him. The guardian knights were nowhere to be seen. He rose and stood before one of the stone statues in the library, drew his sword, and began to strike. First the first technique, then the second, the third, and the fourth. As he attacked, memories of his previous life flooded through him. Years of effort, of hostility from those of direct bloodline, of being denied every opportunity because of his illegitimate birth. This time, he refused to let any of that hold him back. He channeled everything into his strikes. And then, as his blade connected with the statue, he felt it. A hot sensation rising from his heart to his throat. He had done it. The 5th technique. He stood trembling with happiness he could barely contain, barely stopping himself from crying. At a record-breaking speed in Baskerville history, a young hound had bared his canine teeth toward his master. He was 8 years old. He marveled at what he had accomplished. Reaching the level of a graduator had taken him 30 years in his previous life. Now he had done it at 8. The solid aura within him had transformed into a liquid state, denser and far more freely controlled. He was confident he could challenge a mid-class graduator, but he also knew he had to be careful. He could not show Hugo too much, not yet. He needed to give Hugo just enough to keep things moving in his favor, while leaving himself room to take everything he needed. Before leaving, Vicker placed a magnifying lens near the book and let the morning sun do the rest. A small fire caught the pages, and with an almost cheerful expression he watched the book burn. The destruction would make it far harder for Hugo and the hounds to ever reach the 10th technique. He, however, would have no such difficulty. When the guards arrived, drawn by the smell of smoke, Vicker put on a look of sincere apology and explained that he must have accidentally left the magnifying glass in the wrong spot. The guards, terrified of the punishment they might face for failing to supervise him, agreed to keep quiet as long as Vicker did the same. As he walked away, they spoke warmly of how considerate and thoughtful the young master was. Vicker smiled to himself and said nothing. Standing before Hugo shortly after, he described what he had learned in the library as something warm and sharp, yet soft and viscous. Hugo and the head butler froze. They both understood what that description meant. Aura was the mark of someone who had officially entered the world of the sword, and even the greatest of geniuses rarely reached it before the age of 15. Hugo, stunned, reminded himself that Vicker was only 8 and tried to dismiss the thought. Still, he asked Vicker to show him what he had learned. In a coliseum-like structure, with the young hounds watching in confused silence, Hugo released a chained orc into the arena. The massive green creature with bulging muscles and razor-sharp tusks roared and charged. Vicker waited calmly for the right moment, then swung his sword with blinding speed and severed the orc's arm in a single motion. Before the creature could react, he swung again and cleanly removed its leg. The orc collapsed, growling in pain, unable to regenerate. Vicker had calculated that a C-class monster could not stop the hemorrhage caused by a B-class hellhound's skill. The audience was speechless. Then Hugo's eyes began to glow. Vicker's sword lit up with a bright red aura, and with one decisive strike, the aura blade blasted the orc's head clean off. The head butler declared it the birth of a genius unlike any the Empire had ever seen. But Vicker, still wearing an innocent expression, simply turned to Hugo and asked if there was anything stronger. Hugo agreed, and a troll was brought into the arena. Twice Vicker's size, it lunged immediately. Vicker dodged with ease, circling it and letting the audience puzzle over why he wasn't attacking. He knew that only fatal strikes were worth the effort against a creature with such powerful regeneration. After a calculated exchange, he struck the troll's arm nearly off its shoulder. The crowd gasped. The wound began to heal almost instantly. Then Vicker told Hugo he was close to an epiphany, and that if he could not kill the troll with his next strike, he would concede. His sword glowed red. One strike, and the troll's head was gone. The crowd fell into stunned silence. No 8-year-old had ever achieved the second Baskerville technique, a milestone normally reached at 18. Vicker beamed with a look of innocent pride. Hugo sat motionless, unable to fully process what he had just witnessed. A week passed. Vicker sat in the clan's dining area, staring at a bowl of miscellaneous meat porridge. He noticed that everyone was avoiding him, which came as no surprise. Power was everything in the Baskerville family. He reflected on what he had revealed so far and reminded himself of the truth beneath the performance. He was in fact a low-ranked graduator who could weakly execute the 5th technique. He also noticed he had been eating more than usual since obtaining Beelzebub's 3rd slot ability, high-speed regeneration from the troll, now rated C+. Then the triplets appeared behind him. Vicar tensed, fully expecting trouble. But instead they told him how incredible he had been when he defeated Cerberus and the troll. He was so startled he spat out his porridge. He studied their expressions carefully, searching for a trick. Before he could decide what to make of it, the head butler appeared and informed him that the patriarch was calling for him. On Hugo's office, something unexpected was unfolding. Adolf Morg, the Morglan patriarch by proxy, had arrived. The Baskerville and Morg clans had once been close, one a renowned mage clan, the other a feared sword clan, and the past emperor had encouraged joint training between their children, held annually. But the discovery of a ruby mine between their territories had turned the two patriarchs into bitter enemies. Still, the emperor's command kept the training sessions alive. Adolf had brought along his sister's daughter, Camus, a red-haired girl of 8 who wasted no time informing Hugo that he was the thief who had stolen their ruby mine and demanding he give it back. Hugo struggled visibly to contain his anger, and Adolf tried desperately to manage the chaos. Then a new voice cut through the tension. Vicar had arrived, remarking calmly that the Morgs had failed to teach their children not to covet what belonged to others. Camus spun around and marched straight toward him. Vicar studied her carefully, already knowing who she would become. In the future, she would be known as the Fire Goddess of Authority, the Iron-Blooded Empress of Morg, a genius of geniuses who burned entire mountains clean of monsters and manipulated even the imperial family. But that was all still far ahead. For now, she was just a child throwing a tantrum. The argument over the ruby mine took an unexpected turn when Camus used an ice sculpture to illustrate her case, explaining that while the mine's entrance sat on Morg territory, it ran beneath Baskerville land, making it impossible for either clan to claim it outright. She pointed out that the Morgs had offered to pay rent and been refused. Vicar listened, then noted plainly that the Baskervilles had no interest in rubies but had even less interest in letting others profit from their land. He advised her not to enter their territory, since she was the one with the most to lose. Camus, unwilling to back down, pressed her arm across the sculpture into the Baskerville side and demanded to know whose arm it was. Vicar caught her arm, smiled, and said it was his since it was on his land. Her face flushed immediately. She stammered, insisting that was not what she meant. Then Vicar, with a mischievous grin, said, "You're mine." Before she could process the words, he pulled a knife from behind his back. The room went cold. Even Hugo began sweating. With an unsettling smile, Vicar clarified, he meant her arm was his since it was on his land. Camus screamed. Adolf appeared behind Vicar in an instant, demanding he back away. Camus fled to her uncle's side, shaking. After a tense moment, Vicar revealed the knife was a toy, something children in the Baskerville family played with from a young age. Adolf demanded an apology. Vicar offered one with a humble expression, and when Camus warned him through tears that she would not forget this, Vicar simply smiled. The day of the friendly duels arrived, drawing children between the ages of 8 and 15 from both clans. While the younger ones displayed mana sensitivity and the older ones fought live battles, all eyes were on the match between the two clans' prodigies, Camus Morg and Vicar Baskerville. Camus opened by casting 4 spells simultaneously, leaving the audience in awe. Vicar dodged every one and suggested, with a hint of criticism, that she focus on mastering one spell rather than scattering her efforts. Camus fired back with a sand wall, which Vicar destroyed with a single kick. She raised 2 walls, declaring he could not break through both. He punched a hole straight through them with one hand, then flicked her on the forehead with his finger. The force sent her skidding backward. She fell, got up, attacked again, and fell again. Vicar thought to himself that dealing with children was far more exhausting than he had expected. He could end the fight in a fraction of a second, but doing so would create far more problems than it was worth. As Camus launched another volley, Vicar spotted 2 other contestants dueling behind him. He timed his movements carefully and maneuvered so that the mage's blast caught Camus off guard. A powerful explosion engulfed the arena. When the smoke began to clear, Camus found herself sitting on the floor with burned clothes, tears threatening to spill over. Then Vicar appeared beside her and quietly offered her his jacket. She stared at him, confused and flustered, protesting weakly that he would be left exposed. He was unconcerned. As the dust settled and the audience got a clear view, they saw Camas on the ground and Vicar standing beside her, shirtless, a scratch bleeding on his arm from the swordsman's aura-laced blade. The audience marveled at his physique and debated who had actually won. Camas stole glances at him as Adolf swept her into a hug, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. Afterward, as Hugo and Vicar walked together through a dimly lit hallway, Hugo asked why Vicar had not gone for a clear blow. Vicar admitted, after a pause, that he was uncertain how to deal with a lady. Hugo warned him that letting his guard down in battle led to injury, and that he should take the scratch as a lesson. Vicar was quietly surprised. He did not remember Hugo being this way during his youth. The man had always been cold, strict, and brutal. Rumors said his personality had hardened after losing his first wife and eldest daughter. But that was not Vickers' concern. Hugo then asked what Vicker thought they should do about the ruby mines. Vicker suggested giving the morgues control over them. Hugo raised an eyebrow. Vicker explained that their primary goal was territorial expansion, and the monsters and barbarians surrounding the mines would become a problem during that expansion regardless. If the morgues were given control, they would send a large number of people to the area. All the Baskervilles had to do was push the monsters and barbarians toward that region. The morgues would deal with the threat at their own expense, and the rubies would end up soaked in the blood of the clan's enemies. Hugo would not even need to ask twice before the morgues reconsidered ever encroaching on Baskerville land again. Hugo placed a hand on Vickers' head and told him his idea was roughly 90% in line with what he himself had been planning. Vicker kept the thought to himself that this was unsurprising, since the idea had originally been Hugo's, and Vicker had simply carried it out on his orders in his previous life. Before the conversation ended, Adolf's voice interrupted them. He proposed settling the ruby mine dispute through an engagement between the clan's children. As Hugo and Adolf discussed the details, Camas sat nearby, stealing glances at Vicker, her cheeks still faintly pink. Adolf suggested a match between Hugo's eldest son and Camas, until Hugo revealed his eldest son was 25. Adolf waved off the 17-year age gap as irrelevant, but Camas made it clear she had no intention of marrying anyone weaker than her mother, and even less interest in a large age difference. Then her gaze drifted unmistakably toward Vicker. Adolf's expression darkened. He leaned close and whispered urgently that she should not even think about it, reminding her that Vicker carried the Van name, not the direct line. Hugo, growing impatient with the situation, turned the question directly to Vicker and asked for his thoughts. Camas waited, her breath held. Vicker said he accepted. Adolf bristled. Then Vicker finished the sentence. He accepted to do as he was told. Adolf was furious. Camas turned crimson, wondering frantically whether Vicker was simply too shy to say more, and whether his answer meant he was not opposed to the idea after all. Hugo stepped in and declared that names and titles carried no weight in the Baskerville household. Great people could come from the Van line as easily as any other. Adolf stepped forward and stood directly in front of Vicker, examining him carefully. He placed a hand on Vicker's shoulder and pressed down, testing him. Vicker did not move. Adolf was surprised by the sturdiness of the boy's frame. He pointed out that this was not information he thought wise to share, but they could not have just anyone become Camas's husband. Vicker replied that he had not been listening since Adolf said it wasn't wise to tell him. Camas's jaw dropped. Hugo turned away to hide his laughter. Adolf smiled in a way that was anything but warm and requested a private conversation with Vicker. Hugo, mildly amused, asked if he intended to scold an 8-year-old child. Adolf clarified that he was speaking as an uncle, not as deputy patriarch, and that this was simply something that was bound to happen to someone eventually. Camas begged him to stop. He ignored her. Hugo reluctantly gave his permission. What followed was not a conversation, it was a duel. Adolf stood across from Vicker in an open arena while Hugo and Camas watched from the side. Adolf announced he would test Vicker's full capabilities. Then he cast 3 simultaneous spells and assembled a pot from fire, earth, and water magic, filled it with water, and balanced it on his own head. His challenge was simple. If Vicker could make a single drop of water fall, he would win. Vicker studied the situation. He calculated that a direct assassination attempt would carry a 50% success rate and only a 10% overall win rate in a true confrontation. He decided to hold back, show just enough to satisfy Hugo's expectations, and use the opportunity to better understand what Adolf was truly capable of. He charged in a straight line, sword raised. Camas shouted at him to stop, horrified. Adolf blocked the strike with a barrier spell, confident that Vicker could not pierce through with ordinary aura. Vicker clicked his tongue in frustration and pulled back. Adolf launched a counterattack, raining spells toward Vicker, who dodged every one with ease. Camas exclaimed that Adolf never used that level of magic against her in their own duels. Adolf turned to her with a wounded look and demanded to know whose side she was on. Vicker began targeting the same precise point on Adolf's barrier over and over, his strikes growing into something mechanical and relentless. Adolf watched in quiet admiration as the boy's swordsmanship carved away at the same spot with perfect consistency. Then, without warning, Vicker's sword shattered. Adolf smirked and made a comment about the boy's lack of consideration for the durability of his blade. But Hugo and Camas were not smiling. They had seen something Adolf had not. Water poured down Adolf's face in a sudden cascade. A fragment of the broken blade had sailed cleanly through the air and pierced the bottom of the pot. Adolf stood drenched, too stunned to speak. Camas stared at the scene and broke into a deep blush, whispering that Vicker had actually beaten her uncle, and her thoughts drifted, unbidden, toward the possibility of marriage. Hugo, watching quietly from the side, began to wonder whether the hound he was raising was far more dangerous than he had ever anticipated. 7 years passed.